The following webinar features ideas and content from the newly released book, Thinking Like a Lawyer, a framework for teaching critical thinking to all students. The book is available from Proofrock Press at proofrock.com, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or your local bookseller.
Let me introduce our speaker today, Colin Seal. Colin is a former math educator. He's a former attorney. He is one of the foremost speakers and thinkers and professional learning innovators in critical thinking. He is the author of a new book, Thinking Like a Lawyer. He founded Think Law, which is the company that is training teachers around the country in how to do critical thinking, teach critical thinking for all kids. And he is a contributor to Forbes, Education Post, Edutopia, the 74. He's a prolific writer, prolific speaker. And I was reading your book. I finished your book, Colin, and I went on Slack and I told Stephanie, wow, he's just a fantastic writer. And Stephanie's comment was he was a dream to work with. So you really have an amazing talent. So we sure appreciate it. Thank you for joining us, Colin.
Thank you for having me, Joe. I think I do want to correct one thing. You said I was a former math teacher, but I'm actually a current math teacher, just like all you other people that are out there at home with little ones. I just finished going with subtraction, with regrouping, and working with my 4-year-old on some high stakes counting exercises. So, there's nothing former about my math teacher status right now, but really, really excited to be here with so many of you all.
Fair enough. I think we're all in that boat. So understood. One of the things that right out of the boat when you're reading your book, the first thing that comes out is this personal story that you have and how your background brought you to this idea that critical thinking can be the thing that empowers all kids. Can you talk a little bit about your background and what brought you to this place?
Sure. And I think I would be remiss if I didn't point out how incredible it is to have so many people here taking the time to be a part of this conversation. And it goes to the essence of a lot of my why. I do believe that there is a basic human yearning for learning, for growing. And I think for educators in particular, so much of our world is us learning from our kids. So when we don't have our kids in front of us in that same sort of way, there is this gap. So I'm really privileged for the honor to be able to help you all close that gap a little bit today with some learning. And going back to my story, going back to this point of being that sponge, being in that place, I just remember being in kindergarten and in first grade and feeling like a problem. I just felt like everything about me was off. I was getting in trouble all the time for things that I thought were normal, like getting out of my seat and talking to my peers. And I got almost disrespectful about this idea that I would get this work and finish through it so quickly. And at a time when kids like me that were growing up in Brooklyn, New York, who were growing up as kids in free and reduced lunch and in the struggle in the immigrant family, it wasn't common what would happen next. This next step of getting tested and getting selected for this gifted education program that I was bused to. And that unexpected moment, this idea of being in this self-contained classroom where it was all about tapping into my creativity and doing creative writing and making my own fairy tales and having these math lab projects, it was a separate but equal education within a school. And this sense of injustice around access to that type of learning has really kind of spurred this whole momentum, this whole why in my journey of how do I make sure that kids like me that receive education like that is not some rare story. It's not some exceptional sort of thing, but it actually becomes a bore. It's like yawn, another low-income child gets an excellent education. Next. And that's kind of been what we're all about. And that's one of the big motivations around the book, to turn that thing into this pie in the sky idea to a very practical why and how we can make it happen.
Yeah, you know, and that's one of the things that strikes me in your book is um, you've developed a framework. Well, there's two pieces to this. One is you talk about the strategies that are the strategies for teaching critical thinking, and then you also propose this sort of framework, the draw C framework that the thinking goes through. Can you just kind of, Colin, could you kind of touch upon this idea that, first of all, the overarching idea of what is thinking like a lawyer, and then you really talk about 5 sort of strategies that a teacher can use to help a teacher or help a child think like a lawyer, multiple perspectives, mistake analysis, investigation, discovery, settlement negotiation, and then competition. Can you kind of talk about how that weaves together and
Sure,
what that is?
sure, sure. So I think what's helpful when we start thinking about thinking like a lawyer is to step back for a second. And I want all of you that are here on this video webinar to think about that one child that you've taught, that you've worked with, maybe that you attended school with, who was unquestionably brilliant, but found some way to do the dumbest stuff you ever heard of. Like, think about that kid and think about the gap between knowing better and doing better. That gap, we see it in children, we see it in adults, and we start becoming perplexed of like, why does this gap exist? Like, why is it that it seems in so many ways we tend to leave genius on the table? And it really struck me as a teacher who went to law school at night. And in law school, for the first time in my life, I experienced tremendous academic success. I had never been a good student in undergrad and kindergarten. I'd always done the bare minimum. But law school, I graduated at the top of my class because law school wasn't about memorizing random laws and statutes. It was about thinking like a lawyer. And its process of looking at things in different perspectives and making claims and backing it up with evidence and asking questions until you get the information that you need. This was such a powerful framework for critical thinking skills and dispositions. It transcended contexts, right? Because one day you were pouring into the nuances of a construction case. The next day you completely switched gears and were looking at federal income tax law and the nuances of these issues within the business community. And I started realizing if you could take this framework and start using it in education, be it through mistake analysis, where we get kids looking at a science project and they're 2 different procedures that are both flawed, but kids are making an argument as to which one is more likely to lead to better results. Or we're looking at investigations where, sure, teachers need to know how to ask good questions, but don't students deserve to know how to ask their own questions? Getting those impulses, getting those critical thinking mindsets, tapping into that intellectual maturity, that intellectual curiosity. Like, so we talk about like analyzing things from multiple perspectives. We talk about like competition, even this idea of like, for anyone that's here on this call who's in education, there's one thing that I would ask you all to do, or to stop doing rather, which is we should probably stop telling kids that they should become lawyers because they like to argue all the time. It turns out that most law cases settle, which means kids need to become better negotiators. They need to know how to like dissect issues into the interests so you can find common ground. And these skill sets, right? Like, it's not just about knowing stuff. It's about how do you disagree without being disagreeable? How do you speak to be listened to? How do you listen to understand? When we start doing these things that we call soft skills, but are actually incredibly hard in practice, we get much closer to closing the critical thinking gap in education.
You know, one of the things that you just brought up, and I don't know if you would agree with me or this characterization, but I was curious to run it by you. I think one of the things about your framework and your model is that you're creating, and I don't mean this like kids being argumentative. I mean this in an intellectually good way. You're creating an adversarial relationship in the sense that I not only need to know my argument, I need to know my opponent's argument, and I need to know the quality of that opponent's argument, and I need to be thinking about, well, how is my argument better than my opponent's argument? And that it's sort of a cycle of quality thinking that that requires you to have multiple perspectives about the alternatives.
Yeah. I mean, when we start thinking through this idea of like creating that conflict and that drama, it turns out that like the idea that kids really revolve so much of their lives around conflict and drama, the idea that so many adults right now are glued to watching The Tiger King on Netflix shows what we think about conflict and drama. It's a natural motivator. So why not ask our kids after a unit on fairy tales to tell you who's the worst? Who is the worst? Because there's a lot of arguments that the big bad wolf actually isn't all that bad at all. A wolf gotta eat, right? So like that's a little bit different than maybe the evil witch that's just out there doing all sorts of evil stuff for no real reason. So like when we start getting that mindset all the way from early childhood education all the way through high school, we start tapping into something that we know is already there. Our kids come out of the womb as critical thinkers, asking a million questions, and at some point the system beats it out of them. This is a way to restore it back to the way it was supposed to be to begin with a very practical framework for teachers.
You know, so in your book, you talk about this draw see approach. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like what how just overview that about like what that technique is?
Yeah, so when we talk about draw plus C, it goes back to this model that allowed me to graduate at the top of my class in law school. So just so you all know, if we're sitting in a law school class with like 50 kids, you're typically going to give out maybe 3 or 4 A's tops if you're the professor. And to get an A, you can't just know the law. Like knowing the law might get you a C. Having some sort of like application of the facts to the law might get you a B. To get an A, you would have to come up with real creative takes. You'd have to be thinking about the consequences of the case coming out one way versus another way and a big picture impact on public policy. So draw plus C is this idea of if you give a decision that's grounded by a rule. So the D is decision, the R is rule, A is argument for different perspectives, the W is this question, what would the world look like if? To kind of force me to think beyond where I'm at. And the conclusion is just essentially that C part of it. Draw plus C forces anyone who's making an analytical decision to truly address both sides of an issue, but not stop there. By asking this bigger question of what would the world look like if, you're pretty much forced to think beyond this dispute. What does this mean for future disputes? What would it mean if I'm analyzing historical figures and I ask, what would the world look like if this thing didn't happen right here? If this conflict didn't happen just here this way, what would the impact be? And as we start to do this, what we're doing is we're creating muscle memory. We're creating a space where like that phrase, I feel as though, is no longer the prefix to everyone's statement, right? It's not just me giving opinions, it's about me making statements that are supported by evidence. And what's really crucial about this, particularly for gifted and talented kids and other kids that struggle with finding like, I need that right answer. I'm not even gonna speak if I'm not 100% sure of what that answer is. We've now created space to navigate the gray. Instead of being so locked into the black and white, we've created this nuance. We've given kids permission to change their minds. We've given kids permission to be persuaded and to be persuadable. So ultimately, I firmly believe that as adults, we're done. We're over. Forget about us. Okay, I'm done. But our kids, they have a very different sort of potential. They can do what we've really struggled to do, which is create an atmosphere where critical thinking is normal. Going back and forth in issues isn't politically demonized as becoming a flip-flopper. It's called growing, it's called learning, and it's appreciated, it's respected, it's admired.
Yeah, that makes a great deal of sense. In your book, you mentioned that one of the things that you've observed in schools that are implementing your program is that quite often the rascals are the ones that end up being the rock stars with critical thinking, and the kids who are straight A's and know, just tell me what I need to do to get my A, have a harder time grappling with critical thinking because of this sort of ambiguity out there.
Yeah, I mean, I think about this often. I don't think Elon Musk would have been a good student. I don't think I would have enjoyed having him in my class, right? And I think for most teachers, there's something about a kid that's kind of wired that way, where it's just not comfortable. Like they push you, they almost have a belligerence in their defiance and their unwillingness to accept this thing right here as the rule. But don't we need more rule breakers? When some of the rules that we've come accustomed to in our world, being rules where inequities are normal, rules where in almost any community, you can look at the poorest zip codes and predict the performance of those schools. What if that wasn't the rule? Who's going to design that? Maybe it might be that kid that you call a disruptor in your class. And one of the things that we talk about in this book that's really exciting is it's not just frameworks for just basic instruction. It also forces us to rethink things like our classroom management strategies. Is your classroom management really about management, or is it about control? No wonder kids are resisting, because you just really want to control them. What if you created spaces where you can use those same exact behaviors as assets to the learning that's happening? One thing about me, Joel, is like, I'm going to talk. So like at a certain point, like getting me in trouble for talking doesn't really make sense. Moving me around the room isn't really going to make sense. I'm going to talk to everybody, right? And now I'll make a living by talking. Talking is just thinking out loud. So why are we demonizing it? So there are all these different practical tools we talk through in the book that really push educators to approach this very differently and create a world where critical thinking is no longer a luxury.
Hey, I noticed when we had we did the poll about, the different people that were here, we do have quite a few parents in the audience. And I know that one of the later chapters in your book, you talk about sort of reaching out to parents and what we talk to parents about and what we tell parents. What is some of the advice you'd give the parents who are in attendance today?
So the advice I give parents is the same advice that I give teachers. Oftentimes, the most helpful thing that you can do is become less helpful. Your ultimate goal is to transform to the kind of parent whose typical answer to a question like, Daddy, how do I spell hostile? Is, how do you spell dictionary? That's the parent that we strive to become. How can we, as early as possible, give our kids as many responsibilities as possible? And what's interesting about this is the way that this breaks between families that might have a little bit more economic stability and privilege versus families that don't. In many ways, growing up with a single mom in Brooklyn, New York, I was forced to step up at a much earlier age. I was navigating public transportation from the time that I was in 3rd grade. I was like cooking dinner for myself and my family by the time I had started high school. I had to figure all these things out. So like, we've got to think to ourselves, what are the things that our kids need to have so that when they're 23, they're not like complaining about how hard it is to be adulting, right? Like, we've got to really think about our power to create a mindset around critical thinking at home, giving them more of a chance to experience productive struggle so that we're not the ones that are going to solve all their problems, but they actually get the same sort of modeling at home that they need to have in school and in the real world.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. By the way, I mentioned, and Colin, you didn't know this, but I emailed everybody who's attending, and I said we'll do some door prizes for those folks who've come to the webinar. So the way that'll work, folks, is that after the webinar, I generate a spreadsheet from Zoom, tells me who attended, because you have more registrations than you have attendees, so you only get the benefit if you show up. So I'll pull randomly, Stephanie, I'll pull randomly 5 folks, and we'll send you guys, we've got your addresses in the spreadsheet, so you'll win a free copy of Colin's book, but that's how that'll work. Please use the Q&A box if you have more questions. We're going to shift over in just a minute for Stephanie to run the Q&A portion of the meeting, but I did want to ask you one thing more, Colin, and it had to do with the differences between thinking skills and what you call dispositions. How do those two things interact?
Sure. So it's interesting. When you ask people about what critical thinking is, they typically say things like, oh, it's being able to analyze, it's being able to think about things in different perspectives, or, even being able to think about your own thinking, which is metacognition. But critical thinking skills alone are not enough. A lot of times when we think about critical thinking more holistically, it's not just the skills, it's the habits and mindsets of critical thinking. Like, how likely is it that when faced with a challenge, you'll actually stop and apply those critical thinking skills, right? Like, we start thinking about intellectual maturity, like the need to ask further questions, the need to seek clarity, humility. These are all the different ideas that become part of your critical thinking dispositions. What makes it even more complicated, part of the reason that critical thinking is so challenging is it's very context dependent. How often do you see children and even adults that could like write until their hand starts hurting, but they don't do math? Or they'll put their blood, sweat, and tears into a project in fine arts, but they wouldn't even attempt a science project. But if we start thinking about the kind of future we're preparing our kids for, where not only are the challenges like unseen, and the careers non-existent, and the technologies that haven't been invented yet, but they're gonna have to learn how to learn at such a rapid rate. We can no longer rely on this narrow skill set. We gotta graze Jacks and Janes of all trades. What does that look like? It looks like thinking like a lawyer. It looks like this idea that no matter what problem you put in front of me, there's a unique set of skills and dispositions that I can learn how to learn and apply to get to where I need to get to. And I want to point out a very, very important understanding. And this, I think, applies not just to the world we live in, not just to our kids, but to everyone that's involved in our society. We have got to come to a place where we spend less time talking about how to be right and spend a lot more time talking about how to do right. And that distinction is actually something that we don't really ever feel comfortable addressing in the K-12 context in particular, but it's time to change that. Because critical thinking for the sake of critical thinking is not enough. We've got to figure out a way to get our kids to actually do better, not just be better in terms of getting high grades and checking off boxes. So that's kind of the more inspirational sort of idealistic vision of what we're trying to do here with this thinking like a lawyer movement.
Yeah, yeah, and it's built right into your system. I mean, even with that the draw plus C, that W, where what are the implications for the world of this argument that I may or may not win? You're building that in so the kids are thinking about the ethical consequences of decisions that they're making. Yeah,
Definitely.
I think that's. So I'm gonna let Stephanie take over. She's gonna be fielding the Q&A, and Colin and I mean I'll be participating, but she's just been preparing to read through the questions and that sort of thing. It's always a lot more. It's fluid if I'm not stopping to read a whole paragraph before I can ask, and all that kind of thing. Also, I've opened it up so everybody can see the questions, and you can also upvote questions if you have one in particular. So Stephanie, take it away.
Yeah, sure thing. So first of all, we've gotten quite a few comments on your shirt, Colin. Some people are resonating with that message.
Hey, you didn't ask me to ask this, Colin. Please, he didn't. Is this one of the swag that you can get on the Think Law website?
Yeah, if you go to the Think Law website and you click on a Think Law swag link, you can get this on like cell phone cases, hoodies, Yeah, it's a whole thing. It's a whole thing.
Okay, yeah. Fantastic. I just wanted to check in. Okay, sorry, Stephanie.
All right, we got a question. Do you feel that the implementation of Socratic seminars is an effective vehicle for thinking like a lawyer?
It is. It is. And for those that are unfamiliar, Socratic seminars is when you've got like kids sitting in concentric circles and they've got this main text and they're making arguments around the text. But here's my thing. I live in Arizona. Prior to this, I lived in Las Vegas. In the Southwest, as well as many other parts in this country, we've got massive teacher shortages in the thousands. The Socratic seminar is a type of instructional model that takes a lot of know-how to deliver. It's not something that a brand spanking new teacher can do in their first month of teaching. And one of the things that I try to get to with the Thinking Like a Lawyer framework is we don't have to overthink it. We don't have to take a whole lot of planning time, but we can revolutionize the way we look at standard instruction. For instance, just a concrete example. We can take an equation and you can solve an equation, sure. You can say, oh, Colin did this equation wrong. Why did he get it wrong? That's better. Or you can say, Stephanie did this wrong and Colin did it wrong. Which one is more right? Which one should get more credit? Now we've infused drama and conflict. Now we've got a space where they've got to make a claim and back it up with evidence and think about different perspectives. Now they've got to ask this world question of what would the world look like if we valued conceptual accuracy or understanding more than computational accuracy. So like, we can think about the way that we ask our questions as a way to embed more than thinking like a lawyer model easier, more seamlessly into an existing instructional block versus something that's a little bit more complicated like a Socratic seminar. But definitely for a Socratic seminar, this provides a very powerful framing and guidance to do it well.
Great. Yeah. We also got a question from a teacher who wants to share some of these ideas with her high school students, and they're asking what advice you would give to students in this area of critical thinking, especially today. So high school students in particular.
So let me kind of step back and say that when we talk about critical thinking, I think that particularly in a high school context, we often start thinking about there's so many issues of today that might be like controversial or challenging for people to tackle. And you're like, I'm not sure how to get into this. I'm not sure how to like dive into a topic and not end up on the front page in the news or be that one teacher that goes viral on social media for all the wrong reasons. So a lot of times when I think about this idea around how do we create these spaces in our classrooms, because a lot of times critical thinking doesn't happen because it doesn't feel safe for it to happen. There's a webinar that is actually on our Think Aloud website that's called Discussing Controversy Without Becoming the Controversy, which is free. You can register for it and kind of walk through it. And we talk about this a little bit in the book as well of like, you know, you can't go from doing worksheets one day to having a debate around whether we should have transgendered bathrooms. Like at a certain point, we have to make sure we give our kids the ability to learn how to disagree without being disagreeable, like how to create a classroom culture where this back and forth is normal and accepted and doesn't get people so agitated. So part of how we get there from a fundamental standpoint is how do we get discussion norms? How can we develop a place where kids understand the power of using I statements and how personal attacks and how like interrupting people can really make these discussions go sideways. So creating those discussion norms, those community norms is such an important precursor to doing this right. But like I said, I do have some more specific strategies about this in that free webinar that's on the Think Law website. Or, you know, in the book, we definitely delve through this in a little bit more detail. But certainly high school kids need this. They're getting ready for what comes next. They need to have the skill set. We call them soft skills, but they're incredibly hard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Let's see. This is a follow-up to your comments about students becoming better negotiators. What are some strategies you would recommend to build that skill of negotiation, especially respectfully in elementary classrooms?
So because I said so isn't actually gonna move these discussions very far. One of the things that I try to break down when it comes to this is this idea around asking why, like understanding, like, why do you feel so strongly about this thing? Like, why does this matter to you like so much that you're getting so animated and like angry about it? Like understanding that why helps me to see that this might not just be an issue, but there's an interest. Okay, so like, I think there's a case that we talk about in the book about like a neighbor with very loud barking dogs next door. And you start thinking about it, you're like, well, this is really upsetting, but they've got these loud barking dogs because they've got livestock they're trying to protect. On the other hand, like, why does it bother you so much that these dogs are barking? Is it just because they're loud? No, it's deeper than that. It's this idea that like in my home, I ought to be entitled to peace and quiet. Like that's my interest. So maybe now, if your interest isn't necessarily me getting rid of the dogs, but you getting peace and quiet, maybe there's some solutions we can do. Maybe I can like give you some soundproof windows, or I can maybe train my dogs better so they don't just bark indiscriminately all times a day. So like asking why, learning how to understand like why people are motivated and upset and understanding their emotions, it might seem really touchy-feely, but it's very much a super important part of solving very important public policy issues, getting down to that why.
Mhm. Yeah, we have another question that kind of shot up here to the top recently. How do we nurture children who don't like to appear wrong to take the risk of thinking like a lawyer?
Awesome. That's a great question. And one of the strategies that we propose for this is the idea that, like, one, you create spaces where there is no clear right or wrong, okay? A question like, when is it okay to hit somebody without getting in trouble for it? Okay, self-defense. I guess maybe if I'm a boxer, you know, if I'm boxing, like we agree that we can box and I can hit you in the head and it's not a big deal. And like we've created a space through an open-ended question that's provocative, that I'm competent to answer. Like I don't have to go to law school to answer that question, but like I'm able to dive into it because it's open-ended to begin with. Sometimes we see that even when it's very open-ended, we've got kids that are still like very locked into a position or have a much harder time with it. That's what we suggested a strategy of think opposition, where take the example of a case about like, what is milk? I'm sure a lot of you follow this debate around the definition of milk, where your dairy farmers are like, milk should be milk. Comes from a cow, comes from a goat, period. But you got your plant-based people that are like, yo, you got almond milk, you got cashew milk, whatever have you. So say you were to say that there's an argument that says, you know, you don't like milk and almond. You don't milk a coconut, you milk a cow, right? So that's a pro-dairy farm argument. Suppose we ask kids to give me the opposite argument, to use those same facts as an opposite argument. Like, think about the opposition. Think about the counter argument. Doesn't really matter where I stand, but I'm flexing those muscles to learn how to be someone that can understand another argument. And after a while of doing that, you come to a place where you're like, whatever. And this is the reason why lawyers go to court one day pounding the podium on one legal side. And the very next day, they could be doing the exact opposite legal argument, pound the pavement just as dramatically. Because we're not zealots. We deal with the case that's in front of us. And if we can get that habit in our kids, like deal with the problem that's in front of you, we get out of that like lockstep sort of thinking.
All right. Hey, Stephanie, maybe one more question, and then I tell you, for those of you who your questions aren't going to get to, we save these questions and we'll follow up with you after the webinar. So don't feel like you're not going to be addressed. It's just that we won't have time to do it, you know, here. But I will be following up with those of you who have asked questions afterwards.
Yeah, we had another kind of follow-up question about classroom management. So what does your classroom management look like once you're not trying to be punitive, but
so I'm going to tell you, like, in full transparency, I was always a teacher that got the knock on the door of like, Mr. Seal, you got to calm this down. Like, I don't know what you have going on in here, but it's completely out of control and it's ridiculous. At the same time, the proficiency rates that I had at my school, 100% Title I, almost all African-American kids, we were about 14 points higher than the most affluent districts in the city of Las Vegas. So like, it is hard for folks that are very used to what it means to have like a structured learning environment, right? Where kids have their hands folded and like they're sitting up in a certain sort of way. Organized chaos makes sense if it's organized. Nobody learns if there's chairs flying across the room and there's unsafe conditions. But if you start thinking about like a very basic structure, okay, like let's take the general instructional breakdown of I do, we do, you do, okay? Where we're in the class, and I don't know if like this was a scripture in the teacher Bible, but like it seems like people are so married to this frame that we can never say, you know what? I'm going to shorten the I do. I'm going to get my kids doing the they do much earlier in the process. And you know what? I might just go right back to the I do a little bit later. I might break it up so I can capture kids at the extent of their attention spans. I might move my body around the classroom in different ways. I might move them around the classroom in different ways. I'm thinking about all those things that are obnoxious, kids talking all the time, kids getting up out of their seats, and I'm using it as part of my normal flow. So again, it depends on who your kids are. It depends on what environments work best for them, what feel natural to you. But generally speaking, I just want to push you to get outside of the mindset of classroom control and much towards the mindset of managing kids so that they can show up exactly as who they are and bring that as an asset to your learning space.
Yeah, and you know, I do want to ask one last question. I apologize for this, and for those of you who wanted to know the strategies that I mentioned earlier from Colin's book, I'll be happy to email that to you. I don't want you to feel like you got left out there. But Colin, can you? We got a couple of questions about standards-based emphasis in classrooms, about, you know, are kids going to learn content knowledge when they're doing these kind of critical thinking skills? Can you kind of address the degree to which the kids are still learning to the standards under this system?
Yeah. So I want to push even further than that. Like, there's a whole chapter here that's called Beyond Test Prep. Because if you start looking at the tests of today, like, these are not the tests that you and I took growing up. These are tests that involve an incredible amount of thinking on your toes and applied knowledge and the questions they've never seen and formats they're unfamiliar with. So like, this idea of teaching to the test is a myth. We've got to teach our kids how to think critically to do this. So how do we teach kids to be ready for a test like that and then do a lot of like drill and kill rote memorization in our instructional preparation? It doesn't actually add up. It doesn't actually get kids ready for this. So a lot of what I'm talking about here, to be clear, is curriculum agnostic. Yes, Think Law has its own curriculum. We have our own program that uses legal cases for older kids and fairy tales and nursery rhymes in younger grades. And that's about developing those mindsets and habits and those critical thinking instincts in our kids. But the book doesn't matter whether you're a middle school social studies teacher or a kindergarten teacher or an ELL teacher or a gifted resource teacher or a high school Spanish teacher. These are strategies that you can use in your day-to-day instruction to completely change the way we think about who gets access to critical thinking, because we can no longer be stuck in that world of like what and how to. We've got to be in the world of the whys and the what ifs. And if we can get there without killing ourselves, without staying up all night, by making the tweaks to the curriculum that we already have, then we can make that big picture change an actual classroom reality.
Fantastic. Thank you, Colin. We're running out of time. I apologize to everyone, and again, we will get to your questions offline. If folks want to get in touch with Colin, thinklaw.us is the website where his company exists, and you can reach out to Colin at Think Law. He's also you're Colin E. Seal on Twitter, right?
I am Colin E. Seal on Twitter, and I am Colin Seal on Instagram. There's no E there. And then at Think Law US, you can follow our work on Twitter as well.
Fantastic, fantastic. And of course, you know, we're here to talk about the Colin's book, Thinking Like a Lawyer. It is available now on the Proofrock Press website. Don't order it immediately because you might get a free one, but I'll let you know this evening if you get the free one or not. Oh, you know what? Go ahead and order, and then I'll cancel out your order if you get a free one. But it's also will be available on Amazon. If you're a Prime member, you get free shipping. Amazon has slowed down some of their logistics because they're having to stock their warehouses with COVID-19 kind of emergency products. So it was supposed to be in on the 1st, but they slowed us down on the delivery until mid-April, but it should be there by the middle of April if you want to get your free Prime shipping. But certainly proofrock.com, you can get Thinking Like a Lawyer now, and we can ship it out immediately. Thank everyone for joining. This was a wonderful conversation, and Colin, just what a delight it was to get to visit with you. Thank you for being here.
No problem. Thank you all so much. Please keep in touch.